welcome to Varn Vlog.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and this is Josiah Rector, historian of... I think you're technically an urban historian, but you also are kind of an ad hoc labor historian these days. So,
fair way to put it.
I've written a little good deal about Detroit, about environmental justice, about the union's on-again, off-again relationship with that, and how industrial unionization influences it. And I'm going to ask you, so we can get into this a little bit. Marxists like myself tend to get a little itchy around the J word. The justice frameworks are always something that because we are Marxists don't like normativity. I can just like just kind of like talk that we don't like saying that there are values and that we should have, because those values can be contested, right? However, and I'll give you a second to respond to that in a minute. I also know what most, activists, labor activists, environmental activists, etc., mean when they say justice. And so I just translate it into my head to something else automatically, so we don't have to fight over the dreaded J word. What's your response to debates around the framing of environmental justice as justice?
Yeah, I think there's a compelling critique of it, for example, in Matt Huber's recent book, Climate Change as Class War. Mm-hmm. And he points out, drawing on certain scholars who are often associated with environmental justice in the social sciences, like Laura Polito, who have argued that the movement hasn't really accomplished what it set out to accomplish since the 80s and 90s, which is to say that we have this academic cottage industry studying people getting poisoned by corporate capital in so-called fence line communities. All the people who, as the literature endlessly documents, are disproportionately poor and working class, disproportionately people of color, living next to oil refineries, toxic waste dumps, garbage incinerators, and so forth. And we know that, and it's been documented again and again, but there are some who say, that these disparities haven't been cracked at all. And Huber's argument is that this concept of frontline communities is itself problematic, because he's coming at it from a Marxist perspective, saying, if we're going to actually take on the power of capital, we need to build working class power. And the working class in Marxist theory is this much larger entity, right? Whereas frontline communities are this kind of political and conceptual abstraction, all the people living near dirty industries, some of whom are working class people who are employed in those industries, some of whom are middle-class homeowners, some of whom are very poor, et cetera. So is it really a coherent category? I think that's a compelling strategic critique. My opinion is that environmental justice has been defined in a broad range of ways. And as a historian, I'm less interested in polemicizing about the right way to look at it than I am in documenting the history of the movement and trying to understand where the concept comes from and how people have used it in different ways. Although I am happy to talk about how useful the concept is at all. I would argue that environmental justice is not very useful if we frame it in a very liberal way and a legalistic way, which says that we should just focus on disparities, often racial disparities, and who is exposed to pollution. And the goal should be equal, which of course implies everything would be fair if people were equally exposed to pollution. Right, which is obviously not what we want, right? If only benzene was distributed equally in our air supply, right, then we would have a just society, as opposed to it being concentrated in communities of color, poor communities. And that's obviously bogus liberal abstraction. And what we really want is to get rid of this stuff. And we're talking about massive corporations who are not intimidated by yet another academic study, right? You need to build a larger social force. Now, I do think there are ways of talking about environmental justice that are more compatible with Marxist, socialist, and other left-wing kinds of class analysis. And I actually have documented in my work that the concept of environmental justice really comes out of the labor movement's coalitions with environmental groups in the 70s. But what happens over time is the concept gets taken up by a whole range of actors, and now It's more associated with academics and with nonprofits. I would caution overgeneralizing about quote unquote the environmental justice movement, because I think under that abstraction, we're talking about a whole range of struggles, right? We're talking about people in Flint whose kids have lead poisoning, who are laid off GM auto workers. We're talking about various indigenous folks fighting pipelines. We might be talking about occupational health struggles and certain workers getting diseases. So it's useful in some areas of like academic research, but if we're gonna like make judgments about the politics, I think we have to drill down and talk about specific case studies and places, because these are, you know, live political conflicts happening in a whole range of areas at the moment that have a deep history. And so I think it's more useful to document that and then get into specifics than sort of debate in the abstract whether it's good or bad. It's a little bit like debating whether civil rights is a sufficiently radical concept in 1975 or 1965, right? As opposed to like, what is the movement, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a whole set of questions that come up on civil rights. Ones that we won't necessarily get into today, although I tend to think that the civil rights movement was more radical than it is often portrayed, but also had knock-on downstream effects that have not properly been dealt with in the kind of liberal.
And if I could just add to that, I agree with you completely. And I think civil rights is a good example of a concept that is usually defined in this very narrow liberal way, but which has this deep history of affiliation with communists and socialists. As I know you're a frequent guest on TIR, they often talk about that history, and we don't have to, you know, go over the obvious here, but, you know, we know about the ties between the Communist Party and socialists and so forth, and the civil rights movement in the 20s and 30s and 40s and onward. So that's a good example of like a radical past buried under a liberal label in some ways.
Right. One that a lot of people want to stay buried too for opportunistic reasons, because they do not want to deal with the, say, Bircher accusations that the civil rights movement were all secret communists, because, well, some of them were. And, you know,
that's kind of what the NAACP was trying to do, right?
Right. There are many times where I'm like, well, you know, in this question, the Birchers weren't wrong. It's just not bad.
Yeah, exactly. It was a good thing. It was a good thing. Yeah. Yes.
So, but to talk about the relationship between the environmental movement and the trade union and industrial union movement is actually, I think right now, important, because there's a whole lot of people, even on the left, who are positing growth and degrowth versions of trade unionism and socialism.
Yeah.
Both sides of which I find the discourse dramatically oversimplified, as if there was not a long relationship for practical reasons. And I think this is important, between the union movement and the environmental movement, and that the older and newer conception of environmentalism as essentially protecting environments from any human encroachment and putting kind of urban appreciators of nature against like rural workers, etc., is a framework that I don't even think is particularly true, and definitely not, or it doesn't have to be true. That is a choice to zoom in on that element of the situation. And I'll give you an example. You brought up like the most common talking points: pipelines and indigenous peoples, Flint. But a big one that affected my own life and may get often portrayed as a racial battle, even though it was a multiracial groups had to deal with it, was all the toxic waste that was disposed near the poor sections of the city of Augusta, Georgia, and then the comorbid conditions that emerged after that.
Melissa Checker has a book about part of that struggle called Polluted Promises, I think, in Augusta.
Yeah, I mean, that book is interesting. It's one of the few times when you mention a book that I've read for personal reasons, because I've known a whole lot of people develop autoimmune diseases, including my parents, who
wow. I didn't know that.
Okay. Who grew up in Augusta on the poor side of town. So, like, those issues, the reason why people cared about these environmental issues wasn't even like out of this abstract green movement. It was immediate. Like,
right.
So, would you like to talk about, like, how did this kind of began in the 70s? What areas did we start seeing this coalesce?
Yeah. So, the term environmentalism itself is kind of popularized after World War II. And there are a lot of struggles before that where people are dealing with pollution, which people don't call environmental. The earliest use of the term environmental justice that I've seen is in 1970, and it was actually used by a couple activist lawyers in the Nader network, Gary Sellers and Joseph Page. And at the time, they were working with the United Mine Workers on the Coal Mine Safety Act, and they wrote this article for like the Kentucky Law Review, where they said occupational safety and health is environmental justice for the forgotten American. And they were really saying that, these laws that had been passed to, quote unquote, protect the environment weren't preventing coal miners from dying of black lung. They weren't preventing chemical workers from dying of various rare cancers. And the context for this is the occupational disease crisis of that time, which gives rise to organizations like the Black Lung Association. The United Farm Workers waged this battle to get DDT banned, and they worked with the Environmental Defense Fund. And actually, it's the litigation of the United Farm Workers with the Environmental Defense Fund that gets DDT banned in 1972. But you have struggles of asbestos workers. One thing I would say is, like, there is truth to the caricature that you often hear on the right that environmentalism is elitist. It is true that if you look at the big name conservation groups like the Sierra Club, Audubon Society, later the Isaac Walton League, and the like, they are dominated by not just middle class but quite wealthy, often white guys, and they often have ties to things like rural or sportsmen's associations. And there's a whole link between like elitist forms of environmentalism and the eugenics movement through people like Madison Grant and, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, the Boone and Crockett Club. So that kind of like elitist, bourgeois, often racist environmentalism is a major part of the conservation movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But there's a lot of revisionist sort of historical research by people like Robert Gottlieb, Chad Montree, and others, which has shown that there are these battles around the toxic pollution created by industry and other kinds of environmental hazards that do have a working class history and are connected to the history of the labor movement, right? So the whole history of struggles against lead poisoning and other occupational diseases is very much a working class struggle. So, for example, in my book on Detroit, I talk about the struggle against lead poisoning and how like Communist Party organizers were reporting in the Daily Worker about how thousands of auto workers in Detroit were lead poisoned in the 30s and 40s. Now, I could tell a whole history about like the industrial unions, but if you look at, say, the United Steelworkers of America in places like Gary, Indiana, or Pittsburgh, or if you look at the United Auto Workers in Detroit, there's a whole history of fights over indoor pollution. And actually, the science of air pollution itself develops from the study of factory air in large measure. And a lot of these corporations like Standard Oil, General Motors, financed toxicological research to try to justify high levels of exposure of workers to pollution. But there was this kind of like alternative working class tradition of fighting against lead poisoning, silica dust, of course, coal dust, etc. So by the late 60s, you have these very well-documented clusters of disease. Paul Brodeur, who's this journalist, he publishes a series of like articles in the New Yorker that expose the very high cancer death rates of asbestos workers. And these cancer clusters were very well known. There was this like Roman Haas chemical plant in Bridesburg, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, where there's something like 56 workers die of lung cancer in a 15-year period because they're exposed to vats of this chemical called, I think it's BCBP, something like that. But similarly, in the oil and chemical industry, many of these refineries, you have clusters of brain tumor deaths, right? All along the Gulf Coast, Union Carbide, Monsanto, Gulf Oil, and other plants, all these workers dying of cancer. I could talk about that in the auto industry because I got into this because I was doing oral history interviews with members of the UAW who were finding high rates of cancer in the plants where they were working. Like I interviewed this one guy, Michael Bennett, who was the president of UAW Local 326, representing auto workers in Flint. And he worked at a plant where they were making chrome fittings for GM cars. And workers were exposed to all this chrome mist, which is carcinogenic, as well as asbestos. And there's this really high lung cancer death rate in the plant. So these kinds of struggles were happening all over the place. So that's the context where the term environmental justice is used by labor lawyers. And then in 1976, the UAW held a conference called Working for Environmental and Economic Justice and Jobs. And I don't want to go on too long, but I'll just briefly say that conference was an effort to bring representatives of the big industrial unions together with representatives of the environmental groups to discuss areas where they could link together in the joint problem of toxic chemical exposures to workers and pollution beyond the workplace, but also deindustrialization and the fact that corporate American capital was using plant closures and layoffs as a weapon to fight against EPA and OSHA regulations. And you see this across the country from, the timber companies in the Pacific Northwest and in places like Maine to, the chemical industry in New Jersey and then Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. All these companies use the threat of layoffs and plant closure as a weapon against pollution standards. And so in the mid-70s, when activists were using the concept of environmental justice, they were connecting it to ideas about full employment and the notion that legislation like Humphrey Hawkins could create public sector jobs as an alternative, for example, to employment in the steel and auto industries. And it was a kind of like a moderate social democratic Keynesian politics. And this is the last thing I'll say and then I'll shut up. To really understand this, we also have to look at the evolution of labor liberalism after the purge of the communist left after World War II, and the way that the leaders of unions like the UAW and the steel workers related to the Democratic Party and how they thought about things like full employment, like what their particular version of liberalism was. And I do think that these concepts come out of a kind of like left Keynesian or moderate social democratic tendency within the labor movement. And it's very different from the way the term is used now. And that has to do with how the meaning of the term is transformed in the 1980s and 1990s. So sorry, I know there's a lot there.
Oh yeah, there's a ton there. How do you see the liberalization of the labor movement putting it in a compromised position far downstream? So like because when I talk about this, I'm often talking about problems that are emerging in the labor movement now that are based on decisions that were made in the case of the railroad unions in the 1920s, in the case of the AFL-CIO in the 1950s and the purging of the communists in the CIO. And particularly like in response to Taft-Hartley, because Taft-Hartley limits so much of how you can frame actually any of these like solidarity strikes. I'm always like listening to people talk about solidarity strikes, which of course I support, but also have to remind people that they're necessarily illegal. And
Taft-Hartley,
so what things were done in the 1950s that really complicated this by the time we get to deindustrialization?
I do think that history is actually relevant to this conversation about labor and the environment in ways that aren't usually appreciated. So I'll just take the example of like the auto workers and the steel workers. But I also want to talk about the oil, chemical, and atomic workers later, if we could, because Tony Mazzocchi is also, I think, a really important figure if we're going to talk about labor and environmental politics in the 20th century. But if you look at the steel workers and the auto workers, right, they're both a good example of how anti-communism, among other things, and the way that the post-World War II collective bargaining regime ends up evolving hamstrings the ability of unions to fight capital flight and to take strong stances on things like workplace health and safety. So if you look at the steel workers, who I haven't studied as closely as the auto workers, but they come out of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, which is established by Philip Murray, who, as you may know, had been a vice president in the United Mine Workers. And along with Sidney Hillman and John L. Lewis, they create the CIO. And the SWOC, which succeeds in organizing so-called Little Steel by 1937, like the Memorial Day Massacre and all of that, something like 60 out of 200 of their organizers are Communist Party members. And it's well documented how, the communists in places like Chicago and Pittsburgh and other cities play this extremely important role in the creation of SWOC. But then when it becomes the USWA and Philip Murray is president of the USWA, he's the first president, they systematically purge their communists after World War II. And among other things, there were, like, for example, workers going on health and safety wildcats in the steel mills. And they were, of course, black workers are going on wildcats protesting against racist discrimination, where U.S. Steel systematically put black workers in the coke ovens in Gary and in many of the plants in Pennsylvania. And similarly, black workers get put in the most dangerous jobs in the auto factories by the corporations in the same way. So black workers go on health and safety and civil rights wildcats. All workers across racial lines go on health and safety wildcats, violating the no strike pledge during World War II. But with the purging of the communists and the creation of, the hammering out of these contracts after World War II, there are gains and there are losses. Like steel workers see their wages go up by something like 80% between 1947 and 1960. Factory workers across the board do, but especially in auto and steel. And they get something out of the post-war collective bargaining regime. Like, if you're a typical steel worker in Gary, Indiana, or in Pittsburgh by the early 60s, you might have a four weeks of paid vacation and be making the equivalent of 40 or 50 bucks an hour in today's money. But in addition to the fact that the black workers are still being put in the coke ovens into the 70s, and people don't understand how systematic that was, it's also the case that the conditions are still giving people cancer, and there are essentially no rules on the ability to, sicken workers with pollution until OSHA, because it's very straightforward from the capitalist standpoint. GM and US Steel are able to grant these higher wages to workers without their profits being squeezed too much in the 50s because their European and Japanese competition had been destroyed in World War II. And they don't have to deal with a lot of import competition. You have an oligopolistic corporate structure where US Steel is dominating the steel industry, GM is dominating the auto industry. And they're able to externalize all their environmental costs onto workers and surrounding communities. They don't have to pay for any of their air pollution costs. And so, the air over a place like Gary or Pittsburgh is freaking horrible by the 60s. And they're just dumping all this toxic waste into surrounding waterways. And by the late 60s, there's, people are starting to complain. And you have black workers revolting against the ongoing racist conditions. You have environmentalists protesting, and many of the steel workers and the auto workers are participating in environmental protests. In Detroit, auto workers formed something called the Downriver Anti-Pollution League, and they join with environmental groups to protest outside of Ford factories and Great Lakes Steel and others against the pollution of Lake Michigan. And you have all these health and safety wildcat strikes that are going on. So long story short, though, the purging of the communists after World War II, though, meant that any advocacy of union participation in plant decision-making was sidelined. And in exchange for these contracts that grant wage increases and pension benefits, the unions give up any say in plant management. And of course, that means that when the companies say, fuck you, I'm going to the South, and eventually I'm going to Mexico, the unions can't say anything about it. And if you look at the struggle over plant closure legislation in the 70s and 80s, that people like Stott and Lind are involved in Youngstown, Ohio, it goes nowhere. And it's defeated both by Republicans and Democrats. And it's essentially red baited as communism. Any restriction, even the ability to get corporations to notify their workers that they're going to close a plant is defeated, right? And so like these efforts to connect labor and environmental groups are quite ambitious. They happen in many places and they continue to the present. But deindustrialization is like a giant sledgehammer that just bashes the industrial unions. And so, the steelworkers lose half their membership between, say, 1975 and 2005. So does the UAW.
Which is why so many of them are like, organizing transient like TA workers and stuff now, just to get any kind of anything to maintain the organization.
But one thing I want to say really quick is, in the context of the plant closures of the 70s and 80s in particular, plant management tries to propagandize workers and surrounding communities by saying it's the government regulations, it's the pollution, it's the OSHA regulations, the EPA regulations that are causing us to close. Every single investigation of that to see whether environmental regulations cause plant closures found that it was a complete lie. The United Steelworkers of America, AFL-CIO, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union all did studies of plant closures to investigate this question, and they all found that environmental regulations played almost no role in any plant closures at all. It was all about busting the unions and paying lower wages. And the environmental costs added by the regulations were not totally inconsiderable, but it was largely the oldest plants that they didn't want to upgrade that posed a serious pollution control cost. But these were largely like pretty small increases in the cost of production, but which saved a lot of lives. I mean, OSHA did save lives; they just never had enough inspectors, et cetera. But the idea that you sometimes get from the right today, politically, or from corporate talking heads, that these regulations kill jobs, was always a complete fucking lie. But I don't need to tell you that.
There's what I find interesting in this is I think there is a section, and it is a small section, of the current socialist left that actually has bought propaganda from the corporations on what those regulations were aimed at doing. Because there has been a kind of pushback on eco-socialism recently, particularly linking anything to like vulgar degrowthism or even green fascism that is embracing a kind of smokestack socialism, and this attempt to reindustrialize along the lines of the 1950s, which personally I find A, not possible, but B, also completely irresponsible if you tried. What do you make? How do you think that happened? Why would there be elements of the socialists who seeming to have bought propaganda from corporations that has never had a whole lot of empirical basis behind it?
That's a great
why
question.
are our allies stupid?
No, it's good. I mean, it reminds me, I think Alex Gurevich, I don't know if you know his work, but he had a piece in, I think, the Baffler back in the 2000s that basically said the left should be anti-environmentalist, and environmentalism is a reactionary movement. And of course, you can find reactionary environmentalism, very reactionary environmentalism, the anti-immigrant right wing of the Sierra Club, and bourgeois and corporate forms of environmentalism, upper middle class liberal forms of environmentalism. Of course you can. But of course, to be anti-environmental is as reactionary as being anti-feminist or anti-civil rights. It's just stupid, which I think is what you're getting at. Now, on the degrowth thing, in my book on Detroit, for example, I critique degrowth, and I'm sympathetic to. I think Huber makes a lot of good points in his critiques of degrowthers, like Troy Batiste. I think that this is a complicated question, because obviously when we're talking about growth, we need to disaggregate by sector, and obviously we need to dramatically cut carbon emissions. On the other hand, we also can't. So I think the history of the labor movement's relation with environmental politics shows how dangerous it is to disregard the interests of coal miners, auto workers, steel workers when we're talking about environmental policies. And that's whether we're talking about what the socialist left should do, or we're talking about what we would want elected officials to do, which are obviously totally different things. But so, like, for example, what would a climate policy that doesn't fuck over coal miners look like, right? What does a climate policy that doesn't fuck over steel workers look like? And I think that's a question the socialist left does need to answer, because if you look at the consequences of deindustrialization in the Rust Belt and in parts of the U.S. South, it has completely aided right-wing politics. And this is a point that the longtime vice president, legislative director, later treasurer of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, Tony Mazzocchi, often made. And he was one of the biggest proponents of alliances with the environmental movement from the industrial labor unions. And he worked with environmental groups for decades on things like benzene standards. And he originated the concept of just transition, which we could talk about later. But he said, you know, he was one of the reasons that he was the biggest proponent of the Labor Party in the 90s is he saw what was happening with Clinton and the New Democrats. And he predicted that in a lot of the places where his members worked, places like, rural Ohio, for example, right, where there were atomic plants at places like Piketon or Paducah, Kentucky. These are places where plant closures created a vacuum of solidarity and economic security, which was filled by reactionary right-wing politics. And the complete failure of the Democratic Party to address the plant closures and the unemployment crisis of the Rust Belt and other parts of the country, and to embrace social democratic policies was a massive gift to the right wing. I mean, if you look at Sweden, for example, and we're not here idealizing Scandinavian social democracy, but if you look at the like plant closure policies in Sweden in the 70s, like if you operated like a Swedish chemical works or a steel plant and you wanted to close the factory, you had to give very long advance notice. The Swedish corporations under the Social Democrats government had to provide all of this like relocation assistance to the workers and to the communities. It was much harder to close a factory. When you did it, you had to aid with the relocation and the retraining. And, you know, workers were given all these welfare state benefits. Whereas if you look at what happened in like Michigan and Ohio, people just got completely fucked over, right? So, which is to say, if we don't want fascism in this country, but we also recognize that climate change is a serious problem and right-wing science deniers are full of shit, then we have to somehow square that circle of addressing working class pain across racial lines while also dealing with issues like pollution, which are really not technologically difficult. It's just a question of challenging the power of capital and harnessing public investment, and at least in the medium term, having like a sane regulatory policy. And we could talk about what some revolutionary socialist state would do. But if we're talking about anything remotely reformist within the confines of the United States, it would have to mean regulating greenhouse gases into the Clean Air Act. And I would argue something like a jobs guarantee, and massive infrastructure projects and public investment to rebuild water and drinking water systems, to build out renewables, to weatherize buildings. And, you know, that was the sort of Green New Deal vision. But and here again, I think Huber has had some good critiques, because the Green New Deal was hatched in a sort of a left-leaning liberal nonprofit or think tank, the Roosevelt Institute. And because the Sunrise Movement is wedded to, you know, despite their sitting in Pelosi's office, really a kind of an inside negotiation strategy in Washington, they weren't able to build anything resembling a mass movement. And they weren't able to build the kind of relationships with the labor movement that would be needed, because what we have in the labor movement is really fundamental splits between, for example, United Mine Workers, who have been the most intransigent, but which are slowly coming around a little bit on like just transition policies. But basically, they want, they want essentially clean coal, right? That's basically, they have like a clean coal stance at this point. Steel workers represent oil refinery workers, but they're also members of like the Blue-Green Alliance. And they're pushing something like a neo-Keynesian green capitalist approach. I mean, that's what we're working with in terms of the labor movement. And then, you know, you have unions like the National Nurses United, which have supported environmental justice stuff, but of course it's because it doesn't conflict with the economic interests of their members. And many of those nurses are treating people who are lead poisoned and sick because of air pollution, to be sure. But, you know, the labor movement is sectorally divided, and the socialist left should be smart about strategically engaging with the actual unions and building working class power. And, you know, if environmentalists don't have answers to the concerns of auto workers and coal miners and steel workers, then the far right is going to give those people answers, which is what's happening right now. I mean, you look at a place like Mingo County in West Virginia, you know, the place of the mine wars a century ago, you know, and this history of powerful working class solidarity, and how right-wing the politics have become there in the context of the Democratic Party's corruption and abdication of those people's economic interests, and the capitalization on that by the Republican Party.
It seems like if I am being honest, there's a whole lot you have to deal with, because any reformist measure that you would have in the United States context is going to be necessarily limited,
of course,
by the competition of the developing world, and how to have a policy in, like, if there was any reformist victory in the United States, to help out with these other nations who, you know, will often get stuck in middle income trap coal dependency or something. Yeah. And it's hard to I don't think it's hard to do. I think very few people are trying to actually sell that to like steel workers in Ohio or Pennsylvania, yeah, as something that they need, even though until very, 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 like the last year, the infrastructure of, say, a lot of these heavy commodities that we associate with industrial labor are totally tied in with China and these other areas anyway. And even as they decouple from China now, they're still tied into India or Taiwan or Bangladesh even. So
yeah, and in fact, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on how these issues play out in the global South, but I was recently reading this. There's a dissertation by this scholar. I think her name is Silpa Satish. I may be mispronouncing that, but it's about red-green conflicts in Kerala in India, and she looks at how the Communist Party in India and the left-led governments there and the unions have clashed with some of the environmental groups, some of whom represent like you know, villagers being displaced by things like dam projects. And there have been some really difficult clashes there. I mean, on the other hand, like in Brazil, you have like the history of Chico Mendes, the rubber tapper, who was like a unionist and fighting against deforestation. So there are places where like you've had like red-green coalitions, like in Uruguay, I believe there was actually an alliance between communities dealing with lead poisoning in Montevideo, which was horrible. And you have, including some social democratic countries like Sweden, exporting their toxic waste to Latin America, some of which ended up in places like Chile and Uruguay or in Senegal. But you had actual oil refinery workers allying with lead poisoned communities to try to force the corporations to clean up lead contamination. So there are red-green alliances that have happened in certain places. But in terms of like the global dynamics, obviously it's going to look very different. And to be honest, I'm pretty cynical about the kind of turnaround that we would need to avoid 4 degrees Celsius of global warming this century. James Hansen just co-authored another one of these kind of doomsday-ish papers saying basically we're fucked on preventing something like 4 degrees Celsius, which is going to obviously cause refugee crises, inundation of coastal cities around the world, probably contribute to pandemics, ever more forest fires in the western the US, hurricanes where I am on the Gulf. So we're in for a lot of trouble, I think, with climate this century. And, you know, I think like a crude degrowthism is unlikely to be persuasive to enough people, even in the global north, to build a broad coalition. That being said, obviously, there's massive overconsumption of resources and massive, and the how that looks in the global south is going to be obviously very different. But I think fundamentally it has to involve something like red-green coalition politics.
How do you make? I'm going to ask a firebomb question though, one that is not. How do you deal with the fact that red-green coalition politics in Europe has been such a fucking disaster?
Well, I don't think it has been everywhere. I mean, I think
it has been in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, like the degrowth movement is particularly strong. Well, I'm not going to pretend to know it well enough, but I know there's a history of like working class and trade union oriented environmentalism in parts of France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and some of the, I don't know as much about like say Die Linke in Germany and their like stance on like eco-socialism. But I know that there's a kind of a red-green politics advocated. I as someone who works in academia, I've interacted with some folks like Stefania Barca, who is an advocate of that sort of thing, like in Portugal, I believe. But yeah, you have like a lot of like middle-class degrowthers, and you have the far right using kind of eco-fascist rhetoric against refugees. And so yes, like if the left can't get its shit together enough to speak to working people, and the yellow vests in France is a perfect example of this. If it's this technocratic neoliberal thing where we're raising your gas prices through a carbon tax while like not taxing the investment banker buddies of Macron, then you're going to get far right populism. And of course, the European far right, as in the United States, is also climate denialist. I mean, like, I'm sure that Marine Le Pen says that she wants to protect France's natural beauty, as does like Meloni in Italy. But fundamentally, the far right is climate denialist because they're anti-internationalist and anti-immigrant. And if you claim that climate change is a hoax invented by a cabal of globalists or something, then that dovetails very nicely with an anti-immigrant racist politics.
One of the things I think my position on degrowth is actually quite complicated because on one hand, I completely agree with you. There is a certain sector of middle class degrowthers. I particularly see the anti-nuclear movement doing this sometimes. And I am a skeptic of nuclear power, but I'm also one of these people who's like, yeah, but it's cleaner at scale than pretty much anything else we have right now. It is not a long-term answer. Yes, there are tons of problems with it, even with more safe reactors and whatever. I know all that. But if your alternative is nothing, like what do what do you got to do? And I also have been somewhat skeptical of the way green technologies have been sold to people. I'm even, frankly, skeptical of the monetary politics behind a lot of the Green New Deal. But that's neither here nor there. I just think that there's a certain amount of not dealing with the fact that the U.S. dollar's sovereign exception is largely based off U.S. imperial power and the ability to compel people to trade outside of the United States in dollars. I think
I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say there are some like Stephanie Kelton inspired MMTers around the Green New Deal, around people in nonprofits who like to talk about the Green New Deal. But I think like Robert Pollin, who is a good economist with, I think, at least a social democratic, not a Marxist background, has done some pretty good work on how we could actually pay for something like a Green New Deal. And I think Robert Pollin has one of the better set of proposals. Again, there's a sense in which any talk about this type of ambitious reformism is like blowing smoke in the air, given the actual balance of forces in U.S. politics right now.
Right. I mean, yeah.
But I think there are proposals that would work. But what do I know? I'm not an economist. I'm a historian. So, but I mean, I think Robert Pollin has done some of the best work.
So, conversely, I'm not against the idea of a Green New Deal. I think like many things in the social democratic discourse, there are versions of it that are sensible, and there are versions of it that are in fundamental denial. And part of the populist appeal that many leftists like to use for this is in the fact that it is ambiguous, which means that the Green New Deal itself is a kind of contested territory.
Just like Medicare for all.
Oh my God, that's a whole. You want to get me on like even a lot of people who say they're for Medicare for all are bait and switching, you motherfuckers. But there's a whole lot that you have to disentangle with that. And I think, to turn it back to what we talk about, like working class apathy or distrust around this, I think part of that comes from that people see that, don't know what to make of it, and then see that no one delivers on anything anyway. So they start just assuming this is all rhetorical. I like you. Mm-hmm.
Can we pause for just a second? I know if this is a pre-record, my wife's cat is like meowing outside the door, and I'm just gonna let her in so she shuts up.
Just go. Yeah, I can deal with that.
Sorry about
I can't really pause it, but I can edit it. It'd be great.
Sorry, there was this like meowing in the background, and I didn't want to.
No, I gotcha.
So you were talking. If you want to pretend like we're starting again.
Yeah. So what I was saying there is that I think people pick up on the fact that a lot of these policies are actually vaguer, more contested than they're being sold, particularly in radical circles. And, there are obvious ones like abolish to defund the police, where like what people mean by that is so radically different depending on who you're talking to, and so disconnected from a lot of people's lives that it just doesn't seem to have any purchase. But with something like the Green New Deal, I think a lot of people would get on board if it was clarified really what we meant by it, but what they see. All right. And I'm going to bring up a specific instance. Is like during the infrastructure bill, when you attach the green stuff to it, and what the progressive caucus was going to die on the hill on was a carbon tax. They weren't even dying on the hill of like developmental subsidies and anything like that. It was literally just the repressive apparatus, which even I go, that's never going to, no one's going to accept that. Like that is a yellow growth style situation that can turn a lot of people against sensible politics.
I totally agree with you, and I think that the way that Biden played the Sandernistas was kind of sad to watch, and it was sad to watch the sunrise movement get played. The way that in 2020 there were various meetings involving prospective Biden administration people, Biden campaign people, and some of the people who had worked in the Bernie campaign and elements of the Sunrise movement. And there was a lot of rhetorical courting of some of the people who had been affiliated with the Sanders campaign. But then, of course, as was completely predictable to anybody who knew anything about Joe Biden or the balance of class forces within the Democratic Party, they totally threw the Sanders people under the bus once he got in office and allowed a representative of fossil capital from West Virginia to water down the climate policies and to give all these gifts to the fossil fuel industry and so on. But beyond just wringing our hands about corporate Democrats being corporate Democrats, as a historian, I'm struck by a massive missing piece of the puzzle, because, I'm not a fan of the original New Deal per se. I do think that there were some working class gains.
I'm not either, which makes me very unpopular.
If I could just make this point, insofar as the original New Deal contained policies which were opposed by powerful sectors of capital, and insofar as there were certain material gains for working people, however limited, compromised, or flawed, it was only because you had a massive series of strike waves, and because you had a massive active labor movement that was shutting down cities like Minneapolis and San Francisco in 1934, taking 100,000 textile workers out on strike the same year, strike waves in all the major industrial sectors. You even had strike waves among farm workers in California. The working class was militant, and it was shutting down production and scaring the living daylights out of capital and battling with police and National Guard in the streets of America's cities. That it was only that context and the rapid growth of the Communist Party, which, as you pointed out recently in running the numbers on socialism, was proportionally substantially larger than the DSA is now.
Right.
And the Great Depression and the rise of fascism and all that made it possible.
And also like the Soviet Union fucking existing.
Yeah. So which is another way of saying that capital doesn't feel anywhere near that threatened. The economic crisis that we're in is not at all like that. We have a lot of people suffering, and we have a lot of poverty and a lot of inequality and a lot of general shittiness of capitalism, but we don't have 25% unemployment, and we don't have a massive militant labor movement. Now, so then the question to me is like, not are corporate Democrats going to see the light of day and become social democrats? No, they're going to be exactly what they are now, unless, I'm not even interested in the politics of trying to quote unquote push the Democrats to the left. My point is, we're not going to get anywhere unless we can build a broader movement among the masses of people. Period.
Agreed. One thing, and I hated it, was Michael Lind, of all people, who made this point in Compact Magazine, but he had a damn good point that the reason why FDR was not Andrew Jackson was that there were mass political movements that would like rip the country apart if he didn't deliver on his promises. And just empowered his friends. Whereas in Andrew Jackson day, and I guess he's also implying Trump's day, or in Biden's day, that's just not the case. And even when we've had movements that look like they were pretty rippy, let's say the Freud uprisings, insurrections, riots, protests, etc., because all those nouns actually apply to that. The speed of recuperation really took the teeth out of those incredibly quickly.
No, I agree. In fact, I was thinking about this recently. I was watching Norman Finkelstein's interview with Breonna Joy Gray. And he made a point about the force to vote thing, which is related to this, which is he said to her, look, the question is not whether you're quote unquote right on the issue. The question is whether you're building a movement. And he pointed out that this kind of, I think he used the term, what was it? It was like parliamentary idiocy, something like that. But the point is, like, these inside baseball games about like which tactical maneuver could have led the squad to somehow get Nancy Pelosi to put forth a vote. Is totally beside
which they know would fail, but maybe would radicalize the population, even though it didn't in 1992 when the history of something similar happening.
Every single time the capitalist class and the ruling political elites have given anything to working people, it's been through mass movements in U.S. history. And that's where, I'm not the biggest fan of Howard Zinn, but that's pretty much like the message of a people's history of the United States, and it's true. And as someone who teaches U.S. history, I would completely co-sign that sentiment. Like, you don't get any of it, whether it's the abolition of slavery that doesn't happen without what Du Bois called the general strike of the slaves. You don't get the New Deal, you don't get the Civil Rights Act, you don't get any of it without mass movements. And so I think what happens when mass movements are demobilized and you don't have that kind of those sort of large organizations is that the left starts to turn in on itself when we get into these very narrow kinds of tactical discussions, the terminological discussions. Right. And I'm not saying there isn't a place for that, but there's a loss of perspective that I think happens.
No, I mean, well, that's why I began with the discussion about justice, because you could easily debate this whole discussion about like whether or not justice is an ideal framework. Right. It's not. That's not really like here nor there in a lot of ways. It's also, I remember reading recently and talking to a scholar of the Chilean Coordenas about the Marxist getting really pissy about the use of workers' dignity because it wasn't materialist enough in Chile. And I'm like, I can't think of anything that would be a bigger waste of time in an actual movement than getting mad about someone using a non-materialist phraseology that was popular, like, so I realize, for example, why I don't theorize about justice, that if someone invokes environmental justice, it's important. And I think you're right. Particularly when we almost are, when it looks like we almost have power, I'm actually kind of, I think the Bernie moment represented something real, but I also think a lot of people overstated what it represented. And that's a whole different discussion.
Because look at where the labor movement was at that time. I mean, it was, you can't have a candidate-centered revolution.
Exactly. And most of the arguments that I did hear about it were circular, which is like, we need Bernie to take power so that we would have a workers' movement, but we need the workers' movement for Bernie to take power.
Yeah.
Which was, I know people tried to square that circle, but it never stood well with me. And getting the unions to take this kind of thing more seriously, we haven't mentioned just transition. This is the language that's often used about this. I do think that phraseology has been mostly co-opted by NGOs. But there is a point to it where we have to say, okay, we know we're not going to go back to a 1950s style industrial economy, nor should we even want to. But we do have to do something with all this development before everyone's made precarious and surplus population. And when you have large amounts of people who don't work, prison industrial complexes arise are worse.
I agree with I think most of what you're saying, and if I could just say something quickly on the just transition concept. So the concept of just transition comes out of the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union, and I mentioned before how Tony Mazzocchi, he was a legislative director. He played a major role in getting OSHA passed, and he had alliances with all these environmental groups. And actually, he had an interesting take on the anti-nuclear stuff because he represented atomic workers. And he was attacked within the union when he was running for president, and they accused him of being anti-nuclear. And he's like, no, I'm just anti-nuclear companies like Karen McGee poisoning the workers. And I want these companies to be held to certain standards. But anyway, Mazzocchi, a lot of the workers that they represented in the oil, chemical, and atomic industries were losing jobs in the 70s and 80s. And oil and chemical, of course, it was about layoffs, deindustrialization, the refineries becoming increasingly automated. And then in atomic, it also was about like the end of the Cold War and the decommissioning of certain older plants that had been built in the Manhattan Project era in places like Oak Ridge. But there were all these plant closures happening in the OCAW. So in the 80s, they started calling for what they called a super fund for workers. And that's a reference, of course, to the Superfund program created under Jimmy Carter, where polluters are supposed to contribute to a fund to clean up toxic waste sites. But they said we should have a Superfund for workers where there should be, a large federal fund, almost like a GI Bill style program for workers who lose their jobs due to an environmentally related shutdown or economic restructuring in general. And actually, Tony Mazzocchi himself was a World War II veteran, and he benefited from the GI Bill. And he's like, why don't we do the GI Bill again? And all these people who lose their jobs, we could give them 2 years or more of comparable wages and benefits to what they had before they lost their job, as well as free tuition to attend, college, community college or university. And then this was expanded into just transition in the mid-90s. And basically it came out of international negotiations between U.S. unions and Canadian and other international unions, because in 1995, Les Leopold, he wrote a biography of Mazzocchi, and he ran the Labor Institute in New York. And he was working for the OCAW at the time. And in 1995, there was this conference in Duluth, Minnesota, with a bunch of Canadian unionists. And they were debating on like the future of labor solidarity after NAFTA. But they were also talking about environmental agreements. And just transition was sort of like Superfund for workers for an international audience, because they said, Canadians have never heard of the Superfund program. So we need something that like is going to resonate with a bigger audience. But just transition in the OCAW's original vision would have been like a GI Bill kind of a program. It would have been comparable pay and benefits for several years for people who lose their jobs in industries due to various kinds of dislocation, as well as like free education. And actually, Mazzocchi wanted there to be sabbaticals for workers too, and more paid vacations and stuff like that. So, but just transition gets taken up in the NGO world, and then it ends up showing up in like the preamble of the Paris Agreement. And at this point, it's become this kind of vague slogan. And I think it's, for a lot of blue collar people who hear the term, it sounds like the way they're trying to fuck us over now. And actually, I interviewed Les Leopold last fall, and he said he was talking to a laid off oil refinery worker from Philadelphia. And the guy told him, if I hear just transition again, I'm going to punch somebody in the fucking face. Right? Because if you're getting screwed economically, you hear people throwing this kind of jargon around, it makes you angry. Now, if you actually told people, here's a GI Bill style program, would you like these benefits? People are going to say yes if they just lost their job. But that's just a long-winded way of saying that, like, I think that the label does matter from like a messaging standpoint, but what really matters are the policies. And the problem is unions like the OCAW, because of the way the structure of class power was shifting in the industry, didn't have enough strength to force the corporations to implement things like this through their contracts. And they didn't have enough influence, certainly over the Democratic or Republican parties, to get anything like this through Congress. And so what you end up with are just a lot of nonprofits putting out reports and putting out a lot of language and discourse. And after a while, when people are getting screwed over, they get very cynical. But if we actually had something like a GI Bill for workers, or a guaranteed income for people who are laid off, not UBI, but like you're guaranteed your previous wages and benefits after you lose your job in a coal mine in West Virginia or Kentucky, I think that would undercut a lot of the Trumpian politics and the opportunistic climate denialism that goes with it. But
absolutely.
But the problem is, how do we get there? And that takes us just back to the organizing question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I'm really hearing from you that we have to acknowledge now, and we acknowledged it kind of at the beginning, is that the industrial labor force is only 10% to 14% at most, at most of the workforce. The reason why that's variable is like how much of the industrial labor force that is not private do we consider part of that. And the largest unionized sectors are opposed to, not to environmental stuff, but to each other, because you have teachers and nurses on one hand, and people don't like this, but it's the truth. The largest unionized sector is the police. That they are, I mean, they only beat out teachers in density by like 2%, but they do. And I don't know in absolute numbers, because I actually don't know if police departments are bigger than education departments. That's actually a good question. And where there's union growth is all in transitory areas, such as the highly underunionized, but also highly transitory service sector. By the service sector here, I mean restaurants. And then also the transitory TA sector, which is like important. And I don't want to deny that they need representation, but the most you can be one is 6 years. So that does lead to, I get why people feel very desperate about this, and about debates around growth or degrowth framing. Like, one of the things that I will tell you, I avoid the words growth and degrowth socialism, period. Because it totally misses that this involves what I do want, basically a carbon neutral, environmentally neutral, and I don't give a shit about GDP once we start transitioning to socialism. But I do think growth in certain areas and shrinking in others would be natural for reorganizing of the economy. And I do think not only do we have to sell this without a mass movement in the US, we have to link it up to a worldwide movement, which seems pretty weak. And Mazaki was one of the people that came to my mind when you talked about this. The other person that comes to my mind is Peter Camejo, which is the kind of, attempt to correlate this and also get the sectarian left all on board. And then liquidate.
I don't know his history as well, but wasn't he in the Socialist Workers Party and then became?
He was a socialist. He was in the Socialist Workers Party and in the 70s thought that the sectarianization of the left was a disaster. So he actually was one of the people who tried to get on with the Naderites and empower the Green Party as because it was both red and green coalitions that he foresaw, but also red coalitions. He was encouraging Maoists and Trotskyists to get over their historical bullshit and just do something together. Ultimately it didn't work. And I mean, his the history of the end of his life and his runnings for political office and stuff kind of becomes sad by the 1980s. But it is a model of someone who realized the same thing, but from the kind of the socialist end of all this, and also realized that you had to tie the workers' movement and the green movement together, or neither one of them were going to be able to do anything.
I agree, and I would argue that to the extent that we have any kind of environmental regulations today, that's partly because of unions. People don't understand that. There would be. Even the EPA, not just OSHA, the unions that came out of the class struggles of the first half of the 20th century gave us the liberal reforms that we had later, much more so than just the politicians. But as far as the sectoral breakdown, I agree with everything that you said. I do think that people underestimate how much this is an OECD-wide issue. I think. Oh yeah. I think I was looking at the numbers internationally, and I think the only OECD country that didn't see dramatic falls in the union density. I mean, obviously, it's different to go from 75% to 65% versus what the U.S. falling from what was it? It's 33% or something in the 50s to barely 10% today. But I think, which puts us around the level of South Korea. But Iceland, I think, is the only one that didn't decline. But Turkey, the UK, etc. all saw similar declines.
All the other Nordic states saw similar declines.
Yeah, and obviously, and it's obviously different to have low union density in France when you have the labor federations representing workers across entire sectors and so on. But my point is, it's not just that the U.S. left has gotten it wrong. I do think we're dealing with macro structural changes having to do with just the organization of industrial capitalism and global supply chains and so on. But we could do a better job than we're doing. And I don't have the magic bullet either. I think that Camejo and Mazaki are compelling historical figures and got some things right, got some things wrong. So, yeah, I don't have the answer, but I do think that I think that people need to be just pragmatic and recognize that the problems that we face are not just because someone used the wrong slogan, and they're not just because entire sectors of struggle are either good or bad, but fundamentally we're just dealing with complex political challenges which require strategic thinking and debate of the sort that we're engaging in.
Yeah, I think we have two problems on the left, actually. One is the strategic, we don't have the subject of who our politics is for and arises from is rhetorically clear, but in actuality not clear at all. and what I mean by that, yes, we all talk about the working class, but I've even noticed, even like social democrats are more obsessed with battles over the PMC than they are with and who counts and who doesn't, and what we even mean by that. Than they are, than they are with like where the working class actually is, where the union movement actually is, and one of the things I get the most hostile pushback on is just like, I know that we are experiencing worker militancy right now. I think that's absolutely real.
Yeah.
But the idea that it's run to run also led to a rebirth in unions, I don't think there's any evidence for that. And
at most, we're seeing a slowdown in the decline,
which I do think is important.
Yeah, it's just a slowdown in the decline is all we've seen from. Yeah, it's like gained a couple 100,000 jobs, but created more non-union jobs in the same year. So yeah,
right. And we did have a tip where decline was actually a little bit reversed from 2008 2009 to about 2015.
Yeah.
But like if you still look at it from like before 2000, even talking the 80s and 90s, it's still a precipitous drop off. And
it's hard, and it's like as a historian, I always want to believe that this is like the 1920s and that we're just experiencing this pit and then there's going to be the big explosion. But this pit's lasted a lot longer than the 1920s did at the same time, right? So, and that's where I think we do need to have like a much broader perspective on what's going on here.
Well, I mean, to me, it does mean that like part of the stuff about the PMC debates, and I'm not going to get in but one thing that you often hear is green concerns or PMC concerns. And my response to that is bullshit. But the framing of green concerns often is aligned with activists who are college educated and managerial NGOs, which if you want to call them PMC because that's the word you want to use, fine. And I'd also say those two things aren't the same thing. Even like there's a pretty big difference between someone who's in the NGO industrial complex and just somebody who like got a degree and then got all green.
Can I answer that? So I think there's absolutely so like the so-called environmental movement is disproportionately middle class.
Absolutely,
and sometimes quite wealthy. That's undeniable. But I would distinguish between the self-identified environmental movement or people who work for environmental organizations and people who are affected by environmental problems. Because if you look at who's affected by environmental problems, it's all over the place. And it's every practically poor community, working class community. There are certain environmental issues, whether it's the drinking water or workplace safety issues, or the fact that, fossil fuels kill something like 6 million people a year around the world. And there are serious respiratory hazards and so on and so forth. So, or the fact that, forest fires imperil people in parts of California and so on.
Here, like we have
the Gulf Coast, right?
Yeah, we're about to have an arsenic cloud here, or
the fucking Salt Lake, right? And the vinyl chloride, like 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride. There are all kinds of places where they're dealing with environmental disasters or just like slow burning public health problems from industrial pollution, etc. But yes, the NGOs are disproportionately, I mean, like if you go on the job market and look at the classified ads or look at a job ad on a website, what kind of credentials do they want to work at these NGOs, right? They want certain degrees, they want a certain kind of background. So that's going to be a narrowly selected slice of professionals, obviously. And then, of course, you have scientists, right, who have to be highly educated. So of course, it's going to be like a small credentialed elite in those organizations and in those parts of academia. That's not, to me, surprising. And to me, it doesn't take away from the importance of the issues, but it does it does point to a huge disconnect, which is sometimes overcome and sometimes isn't overcome. Like, again, I mean, most of the unions have some connection to environmental politics. And sometimes it's at the staff and executive level and the rank and file isn't really involved. I mean, I've been to a union hall event where green jobs were being discussed by a bunch of credentialed staffers, and there were building trades workers there actually, I went to this one event at the Seafarers Hall in Houston where two construction workers were arguing, and one guy was like, yeah, I would like to get into offshore wind. It sounds great. And the other guy was like, I think that's bullshit. These jobs aren't going to happen. So, and workers are of course not monolithic, and there are workers who would be proud and happy to work in a good, high-paying, unionized job building, solar panels or whatever. It's just they're really hard to find, and most of the renewable energy industries are low-wage, anti-union, and there's not enough of them around. So,
yeah, I think people actually don't know how polarized the renewable industry is, with like engineers making a shit ton of money and a lot of like technicians making nothing.
Right. And then you have like slave labor in the cobalt mines in the Congo providing raw materials for those batteries.
I mean, electric
vehicles. So like,
yeah, I mean, that I get the cynicism on, and particularly when you see large amounts of, I mean, I think about the renewables bill that all the liberals were telling me was the biggest thing that we've ever done, and actually in some ways they're right. Even though it was stuck in the middle of an inflation act, which was funny, but also like, it's, when you look at what it did and how it tied it to coal and other traditional energy growth, it was kind of a joke. And the way that we could handle that would be to really look at these jobs, to make these renewable energy jobs desirable. To not make them another way in which we're further precarionizing and lumpenizing, or whatever you want to talk about, a large portion of the working class. And until you do that, I mean, I can tell you, because I have former family because it's by marriage, from Pennsylvania, as we say, which is like Ohio and Michigan, parts of I like to call the Rust Belt, because the economy is run on tears. But that's hyper anti-environmentalist, because the only jobs available to them are like tied into strip mining,
which is funny, because the United Mine Workers of America, actually, the Miners for Democracy, were anti-strip mining. And there is this history of working class environmentalism, which is largely forgotten. But yeah, of course, today, hyper reactionary politics, completely.
Well, the thing is, it's not in their interest. Strip mining is not in the long term in their interest. It's only in their immediate interest. And
there have been thousands and thousands of cancer deaths and birth defects caused by mountaintop removal and all the shit that it puts in the water there.
Right. And like, I will say that like if you're talking about people in Kentucky or whatever, or anywhere in Appalachia, a lot of them do realize how fucked up it is. It's just, they don't think anyone's going to offer them anything else, and this is the job they have. And until you can provide something, they have no reason to trust you.
Completely, right? No reason at all. And a lot of these environmental problems, it's like, okay, my kids got lead poisoning, so it might cause neurological problems. Or I've been exposed to carcinogens, so I might get cancer and die in my 50s instead of my 70s. But if I lose this job right now, I'm fucked right now. And it's often a time horizon conflict with things like environmental cancers and the like. They can take decades, they have a long latency period. But those unionized jobs, if people have them, I mean, there's only like 36,000 active coal miners left in Appalachia at this point. And those are some of the last good jobs. Right? So how could you, I mean, a lot of those people would be in prison or in the military if they didn't have it. So I don't blame them at all, which is why I think, unless you're offering like a GI Bill style program and like huge New Deal level public works investment, then of course they're going to tell you to go fuck yourself and vote for Trump or DeSantis in 2024. Of course they are.
Which means on almost every level, and I actually think this about even stuff like sexual justice stuff and stuff like that, which I prefer to frame in terms of bodily autonomy, because people understand that and can feel that. One of the things that I worry about the way so much of this is framed, and including how we started, like all these poor victim stories, like look, my family was probably directly victimized by the poor conditions of the Savannah River plant, which was a toxic race dump. But no one likes to be fucking told they're victims, particularly working class people. Like that is not a mentality. It's actually weird. I do think this actually is a socialization problem where in academia, because it is based on schools and there's this vague notion of meritocracy, there's the idea that like being a victim means that you're entitled to certain modifications on grounds of fairness, and that is the way a lot of these people think about this. But when you approach people who are actually not from that culture, that has no purchase, yes, fairness matters. Everybody cares about fairness. Even I, who's who talks about justice as a fairy tale you tell to children, care about fairness. But that's not like, people don't want to see themselves primarily as victims.
And people aren't stupid. I remember years ago, I was very briefly in the Socialist Workers Party, and I remember in like 2006. I remember in 2006. We drove out to Western Pennsylvania, and I was based in Philadelphia at the time. And we went door to door, and they were trying to sell copies of The Militant to people in this coal mining town where the mine was on the verge of closure. And I remember we went to this house, and this woman invited us in, and there was, I think there was a guy who might have had black lung who was sitting there, like a retired coal miner. And they wanted to talk about how, the corporations are terrible and the capitalists are terrible. And it was completely out of step with anything these people needed to hear. It was ridiculous to kind of bring some class struggle message from the 1930s to these people. It was silly. But at the same time, like even the just transition thing, actually, Richard Trumka, before he died, he used to hate the just transition idea. And he said it's an invitation to a fancy funeral. Although he came around on it at the end of his life before he died and admitted like global warming is a thing. And, we could debate what you want to call it. I mean, Matt Huber has a critique also of just transition frameworks, because he says like they're disempowering and they're not empowering, which I think gets to what you were just saying, Derick. Because if you tell people, look, your jobs are going to go away, we can't save this industry, but we're going to help you transition to something else, even if we do it in a really generous way, that is kind of disempowering as a message, versus like, you're going to take on the bosses. I mean, I've been to Flint, and I remember going to protests when I lived in Detroit, going up there when all these pissed off people who had been given poison water were protesting. And some of them were using environmental racism, environmental justice as slogans. Many of them are black, many of them are white. And some of them are former UAW members and auto workers who had worked in the GM plants in Flint, like this woman, Claire McClinton, who I know. But they felt empowered because they were joining together solidaristically to demand what they consider to be justice. And so I think the context matters, and a lot of it I think is just like organizing common sense, right? Like what is going to work for particular people in particular communities and what isn't, what message fits, what message doesn't. And if people are already mobilized and organized using a particular set of slogans and it means something to them, we can't as socialists come to them and be like, I disagree with that framing, right? Like it's not for us to dictate how people define their struggles on that level. But we can make arguments about framing, certainly. But if people are already organized around certain slogans, like we're not gonna, you know what I mean?
I'm with you on that. I mean, Just Transition and Degrowth are like very different in some ways, but they both have a similar problem where people are caught up in the framing even more than what except for when you're talking about out and out primitivist, of which case that is only, I would venture, is only really appealing to people in the Pacific Northwest. And the reason why
John Zerzan, is he still alive?
Yes, he's still alive. And I say that because you can believe a lot of things about climate, and about nature and people's ability to like co-mingle with it if you're in the Pacific Northwest. Whereas out here in Utah, you're just like, no, that'll fucking kill me. I like that's nothing but like shit desert for like a billion million miles. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
That's actually a good point. And actually on the Pacific Northwest, sort of Earth First had a lot of really bad politics in it, and a lot of like neo-Malthusian politics. Although Judy Berry, who worked with them, she actually like had a trade union background, and when she was fighting to save the California redwoods, she actually helped to organize workers actually at like a pulp mill in Fort Bragg, through the IWW. And even in places like that, there are some people who have like some kind of sense of class politics, but most of them don't.
Yeah, I talked to a people who used to consider themselves like Earth First anarchists who got really disgusted with the neo-Malthusianism, and also like not learning the lessons of like, oh, I forgot her name. She was one of the few successful environmental activists who really focused on like getting working class people on her side.
Well, I was talking about Judy Berry.
Yeah, Judy Berry. Yes.
Yeah.
And like not learning the lessons of Judy
He
Berry.
got them to stop tree spiking.
Right. I mean, just huge deals because she thought about the framework that we're talking about here. Like, like if you tell people, okay, you're really attached to land, you don't give a shit about like, about like the scenic beauty, but you do really care if there's going to be a future for you and your family here. Right. Like that's a completely different conversation. I think one of the things I get frustrated with is, while I am also skeptical that we're going to be able to do shit about getting below 4 degrees Celsius, I get really worried about the hyper doomerism coming out of a lot of environmental activists, because I'm just like, one, even though, yes, climate change will be of 4 degrees Celsius will be very bad. It will be. It is not the end of human civilization necessarily. When you always frame this like that and you make it sound like we can't do anything about it, I don't know what you think you're going to get when it is of something that is actually this important.
No, I agree. There's areas of like deep ecology and doomerism. It's almost like the critiques of Afro-pessimism could also be applied to that. It's like enviro-pessimism. It's a luxury for certain middle-class intellectuals to talk about how the end is nigh. But if you actually are worried about, where your next meal is going to come from, or feeding your family, or just, living paycheck to paycheck, you're unlikely to be caught up in these kind of abstract fears about what's going to happen 20, 50 years from now anyway. Right. And it's a time horizon luxury in some ways of middle-class intellectuals to be freaked out about 2100. So yeah, it's like we need to think in terms of what is going to solve people's problems right now. And then, yes, we should be aware of what the science says about what may happen further down the line. But we have to, even if the worst case scenarios come true, that doesn't alter the fact that we shouldn't be stupid about our politics.
Right. And we definitely shouldn't be all Paul Ehrlich-y and like talking about like basically letting all the brown people die.
He's totally proven wrong on many levels. And he got kind of punked by right-wing economists like Julian Simon. And I'm not a fan of those neoclassical economists, but they did, like, he won his bet with Paul Ehrlich about, like, what was it, metal scarcity? There's this book called The Bet by Paul Sabin that talks about how Paul Ehrlich made this bet with Julian Simon that we would, like, run out of certain resources, and was totally wrong. And he also was wrong about the overpopulation crisis.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, you look really stupid if you say, the world is going to end, we're going to run out of resources.
But yet I still see people asking, like, Paul Ehrlich still being asked to go fucking talk to the UN. Yeah. Despite the fact that, like, it's not just that his book was wrong. Parts of his book are gross. Like,
and very racist too. And I think we should view those types of environmentalists the same way we view Larry Summers or Paul Wolfowitz, like people who are really wrong about big important things, who should not be taken seriously, who are nonetheless part of this kind of like intellectual elite that actually I shouldn't use that term to describe Paul Wolfowitz, but
part of an intellectual elite. I don't know. I mean, it's I think we do have to, I am uncomfortable ceding all the skepticism of like the totally neo-Malthusian deep green people to fucking libertarians.
I agree.
While also I am also slightly, my friend Lee Phillips will occasionally make fun of me for not being pro technology enough or something. Yeah. And I'm just like, Like, stuff is as good as how we organize around it, my friend.
We could probably spend an hour talking about like science and GMO stuff and all that, but
yeah, and that's another thing where I do think a lot of that, weirdly, to have an informed conversation about that, you do have to be of a certain class because you have to have a certain amount of scientific background. Like, and focusing solely on that, our fears around it are confusing. But then a lot of times when that is like when people's over fears of, say, genetically modified food are exposed, they're exposed by people who have also pretty sketchy interests and don't deal with the problem of the way those things are produced.
And I know we have to wrap up pretty soon, but if I just have one major takeaway, it would be it's dangerous to treat large-scale, complex social movements as monoliths, and it's also lazy and stupid. And
yes,
we could have a field day talking about shitty forms of environmentalism.
Oh yeah,
but it's a little bit like how right-wingers love to talk about how Margaret Sanger was a racist to justify anti-feminist, anti-abortion stances, as if that was the totality of the feminist movement, right? And we could talk about how mainstream feminism, going back to the suffragettes, was dominated by like elite white women, etc. But we would also find various kinds of working class feminism and working class women who fought for abortion rights, and in the labor movement, and so on and so forth. And it's the exact same thing with the environmental movement, right? Like, there are lots of generalizations that people can make about environmentalism that may be true about important strains within it that very much deserve criticism. But there is this like rich history of working class and labor union oriented environmentalism, and some, like, I would say, more sane forms of eco-socialism that have an interesting background, even really going back to Marx and Engels.
Right.
So, like, I just think we should be well informed enough to talk about different segments of the movement and different like histories, as opposed to kind of like lazy sweeping generalizations that some people like to indulge in.
That may be a theme of my show, is like all the lazy sweeping generalizations are bullshit. From pro or anti, and that's also, I'd also say that for a lot of positive generalizations too, like the workers' movements in general on the good side of history, but there have been times where it hasn't been.
Of course.
And whatever the fuck the good side of history means, I don't even know. I don't know history has sides like that. But I think this is important, though, for people to understand, in the sense that a lot of the better protections we have gotten from the Green Movement in liberal stories get put on legislation in the courts. And in reality, the legislation and court action is downstream.
It is
from not just activist actions, but also union actions that have been largely written out of the history.
Completely. Just like there's no OSHA without people like Tony Mazzocchi and so on and so forth.
Right, exactly. So without that and that understanding, we also can't deal with the problems we have now. And we leave workers in a real shitty bind where they can follow their immediate interest and also maybe justify some stuff that's hard to justify in following their immediate interest by adopting right-wing pandered bullshit ideologies, or we can really offer them something and, the truth. But the truth itself isn't going to be enough. And I don't think it's enough for anybody, frankly.
It's not just a struggle over knowledge, it's a struggle over resources. But no, I completely agree with everything you said. Yeah.
Thank you, Josiah. Interestingly, I was like, I should probably reach out to Matt Heber soon. And then I went and discovered that he follows me on Twitter, and I didn't even know that. But you and I are going to have another discussion in a few months about how, I think in a much more specific way, what we might call the NGO industrial complex emerging out of the crisis of the deunionization and deindustrialization.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk about Detroit.
Anytime we can talk about Detroit, Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philly. If we're not talking about Southern stuff, because that's I'm a Southerner. Can't you start talking about New Orleans and Atlanta, you're talking about family. But
I'm in Houston, which is full of people from New Orleans. So
yeah, yes, you are. But for some reason, I have either dated or married a whole lot of people from the Rust Belt, maybe because they all left. Yeah. So I also have like strong ties through ex-wives and partners to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so
a lot of Detroit people in LA.
Oh yeah. There's lots. Let's be honest. There's lots of Detroit people everywhere. Like there's lots like Michigan people. I mean, Michigan is. I've encountered Michiganders.
Michigan diaspora.
Yeah, everywhere in the country because it's like when you encounter Florida school teachers, my friend. Like when I this is a side note, but you can always tell when the sector is suffering when you're abroad and like every third person you meet is from 2 states. And it's like, oh, because you would go anywhere to get out of that job. Like, so like we were like teaching in like cartel war torn Mexico, and I'm like Arizona, Florida, Arizona, Florida, Arizona, Florida, and I was like, yep, I guess it makes sense. Similarly, a lot of the Rust Belt is been dispersed because there's no jobs, and another thing I've been really big into talking about a lot more lately, because we always talk about these big cities and maybe Chicago and Pittsburgh come up, but I'm like, all these industrial cities, and they're not all in the Rust Belt. Like
Birmingham, Alabama.
Yeah. Birmingham, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, Macon, Georgia, where I'm from. Jacksonville, Florida. Yeah. All these fucking mill towns and shit that have been totally bombed out. And if you want to see, like, if you actually want to look where the per capita crime is, where the real poverty is, where a lot of people are downstream of the worst environmental policies, it's in those places.
Louisville and
I think it is a little bit more obvious in the upper Midwest and the Twin Cities because those are major cities where that's happened. But in general, when we're talking about LA or New York or even Chicago, I tend to think, oh, this is culture war bullshit, because when I look at the numbers, it's not going to back up either side of this equation. But when you're talking about Birmingham, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi, to some degree, I would say New Orleans. New Orleans is a place that's been like just perpetually fucked over and currently being allowed to fall straight into the ocean.
Think a lot of the North has been Southernized and a lot of the South has been Northernized.
Yes, that's actually a good way to think about it. And by that we mean made shitty in new ways. So the shitty parts of the North came south, and the shitty parts of the South came north.
And so many of the people in states like Michigan have roots in the South, right? It's Appalachian whites and it's Southern African Americans.
Oh yeah,
many of the people around Detroit are from Alabama and Mississippi and Kentucky, and a lot of people go back and forth and have been going back and forth. So
one of my best friends is a black woman who considers herself a Detroiter, but her mom is from the same city I was born in.
Perfect example. And there are many people like her. Yeah.
Yeah. And we talk about like Black African American food versus like Southern food, and I'm always like, well, most Southern food's Black food anyway, but even the part that isn't, we can't tell the difference, except when you say something like chicken and waffles, which is not something we eat in the South, but everybody thinks we do because in some subconscious way people realize that Black and Southern are somehow the same, but in a real sense, that's a cultural diaspora that you also immediately recognize, because you're like, oh well, yeah, of course you went. And then a lot of it came back. I mean, a lot of Black people from Detroit came back to Atlanta. And I do find it interesting that I don't hear socialists deal with these internal things in the United States very much, and I feel like we just end up talking about New York and LA and Seattle and Portland a lot, and I'm just always like,
these were pretty. Yeah, I mean, this will be a whole other conversation, but like, there's some lively DSA chapters in Texas, and I don't know as much about, and I understand the DSA is a whole separate conversation and far from the totality of socialism. But, and actually, there's actually a lot of like PSL activity recently in Texas. But anyway.
So, yeah, I am ambivalent about both those groups, but I will say that when you encounter socialists in red states, and I think there's a sociological reason for this, they tend to be far more radical than encountering your average socialist in New York or LA, partly because the stakes are higher, and also partly because if you're going to go there, why not just go all the fucking way? Like,
well, I think there's definitely an under-recognized history of just Southern radicalism, and these so-called red states have deep socialist economists and labor union histories anyway. And we could say the same thing, of course, about so many parts of the North that have been sort of written off as Trump country in sort of coastal liberal discourse, and the way that idiots talk about Ohio and West Virginia and so on and so forth. But I know that would probably take us too long. And
that's another conversation, but we should have it because I've lived in, quote, red states, even though they used to be run by Democrats in my lifetime, my entire life. I have only in a few months, red or purple states. I have, for a few months lived in California, but never for any significant time. And New England is a weird alien place that I'm not sure that I would understand. So it's full of Protestants and WASPs and people I don't trust. So,
there's interesting differences even within New England, but
I mean, even that,
like Western Mass versus Eastern Mass, very different.
Connecticut versus everybody else. Vermont's actually particularly weird. Like, the Bernie story is a story of a very particular kind of politics. It's hard to understand. So I mean, I think this regional stuff, I think socialists need to take this regional stuff a lot more seriously if they want to have a reform strategy. Like, because
there's a lot of very organizable places that deserve organizing.
Right. And would be receptive to it if and for a while, to give the DSA some credit, it looked like they were going down that strategy, but then in the last 4 or 5 years they've really doubled down in California and New York. So, and that makes sense. There's lots of people there, right? But like from a be able to horse trade and like have an answer to a dipshit like Joe Manchin, you kind of need people in those kinds of areas. So, and there used to be a lot. I mean, even the progressive caucus used to have a lot more people out of those areas. Like, it's been kind of lost now. We both need to go though. Thank you so much, Josiah. And I'd love to have you back to talk about all the things we talked about today. But I think, like I said, the key takeaway is green politics to some degree has to be tied to working class politics, or it doesn't have a future. And if it doesn't have a future, I'm not sure we do. Like,
I completely agree. And no, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on.